The dust devil that kicked up beside the old wagon trail should have been warning enough. But Blake Rawlins had never been one to read signs, which is why he nearly rode past the crumpled figure on the roadside 3 miles outside Council Bluffs, Iowa, on that scorching July afternoon in 1875. Something made him pull back on the reins, some instinct that had kept him alive through cattle drives and range wars, and when he turned his gelding around, he saw her. A woman in a torn calico dress, clutching an empty burlap bag to her chest like it held the crown jewels instead of nothing but air and broken dreams. Blake dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the packed earth with a soft thud. The woman looked up at him with eyes the color of storm clouds, her dark hair matted with dust and what might have been blood near her temple. She could not have been more than 23, maybe 24 years old, with high cheekbones and a proud set to her jaw despite the obvious desperation in her circumstances. "Madam," Blake said, keeping his voice gentle as he approached. He had learned long ago that frightened people could be as dangerous as cornered animals. "You hurt?" The woman's fingers tightened on the empty bag. Her lips were cracked and dry, but when she spoke, her voice came out clear and strong, surprising him. "I lost everything except hope." Those 7 words hit Blake harder than any bullet ever had. He had seen plenty of desperate folks in his 32 years, had passed by most of them with nothing more than a nod and maybe a canteen of water if he was feeling charitable. But something in this woman's eyes, in the way she held that empty bag like it still mattered, made him kneel down in the dust beside her. "What happened?" he asked, pulling his canteen from his belt and offering it to her. She took it with trembling hands and drank deeply, water spilling down her chin. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and met his gaze directly. "Bandits. 4 of them, maybe 5 miles back. They took the wagon, my father's watch, the money we had saved. Everything." Her voice caught on the last word, but she did not cry. Blake found himself respecting that. "They left me the bag, said it was a mercy that I could use it to carry my belongings. This was all I had left in it." She opened the bag to show him it was indeed completely empty, not even a scrap of fabric or a loose button. The emptiness of it seemed to symbolize something larger, something Blake could feel in his own chest. "Where were you headed?" he asked, though he was already forming a plan in his mind, one that probably made him 7 kinds of fool. "Council Bluffs. I was supposed to meet my cousin there. She runs a boarding house on 3rd Street, said she could give me work." The woman's shoulders sagged. "But that was supposed to be 3 days ago. I have no money for a room, no way to clean myself up enough to be presentable. I look like something the cat dragged in." Blake could not argue with that assessment, but he had seen worse. "Can you stand?" She nodded and started to push herself up. Her legs gave out almost immediately, and Blake caught her before she hit the ground again. She weighed next to nothing, and he realized with a start that she probably had not eaten in days. "When did you last have food?" he asked. "Yesterday morning. Some berries I found by a creek." She steadied herself against him, clearly embarrassed by her weakness. "I am fine. I just need to rest a moment." "You need more than a moment, madam, and you still have not told me your name." Grace Zimmerman." She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw a flicker of curiosity in those gray eyes. "And you are?" "Blake Rawlins. I run cattle between here and Omaha, though lately I have been thinking about settling down somewhere." He made a decision then, one he would question plenty in the days to come but would never actually regret. "Come on. My horse can carry us both into town. We will get you fed and cleaned up, and then we will find this cousin of yours." Grace pulled back slightly. "I cannot pay you." "Did I ask you to?" Blake kept his tone mild, but he felt a flash of irritation. Pride was fine and good, but not when it kept a person from accepting help they clearly needed. "Look, Miss Zimmerman, you can sit out here and die of exposure holding that empty bag, or you can accept help from a stranger who happens to be heading in the same direction you need to go. Your choice." She studied his face for a long moment, and Blake got the sense she was taking his measure, trying to decide if he was trustworthy or just another kind of threat. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she finally nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Rawlins. I accept your help." "Blake," he corrected, leading her over to his horse. The gelding, a patient old bay named Chester, barely flicked an ear as Blake helped Grace mount up. She sat side saddle, still clutching that damned empty bag, and Blake swung up behind her. The contact was immediate and unavoidable, her back against his chest, and Blake tried not to notice how she fit there, tried not to think about how long it had been since he had held a woman, even in circumstances as chaste as these. The ride into Council Bluffs took about 40 minutes, and Blake learned more about Grace Zimmerman in that time than he had learned about most people in years. She had grown up in Pennsylvania, the only daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died when Grace was 12. Her father had passed 6 months ago from pneumonia, leaving Grace with nothing but debts and that wagon full of their belongings, which she had been bringing west to start over. "My cousin Martha wrote that there were opportunities here for women willing to work hard," Grace said, her voice steady despite what Blake could feel was exhaustion radiating through her body. "She said I could help her run the boarding house, maybe eventually buy into it as a partner." It was supposed to be a new beginning. "It still can be," Blake heard himself say, and he meant it. "Those bandits took your things, but they did not take you. You are still here. That counts for something." Grace was quiet for a moment, then she said softly, "That is why I said I still have hope. Because I am still here. I am still breathing. I can start over." They crested the hill that overlooked Council Bluffs, and the town spread out before them, a bustling frontier settlement sitting pretty on the eastern bank of the Missouri River. Steamboats lined the docks, and even from this distance, Blake could hear the sounds of commerce and life, the kind of noise that meant civilization was taking root in what had been wilderness not so long ago. "It is bigger than I expected," Grace breathed, and Blake felt her sit up straighter, as if the sight of the town was giving her strength. "It has grown considerably in the last few years," Blake said. "The railroad coming through helped. Lots of folks passing through, lots staying to build businesses." He nudged Chester down the hill toward the main road. "Your cousin's boarding house on 3rd Street, you said?" "Yes. The Zimmerman house, Martha calls it." Grace hesitated. "But I cannot show up looking like this. She will think I am a beggar. You are family, she will understand." But even as Blake said it, he knew Grace was right to be concerned. First impressions mattered, especially in a town like this. "Tell you what, there is a hotel near the center of town, the Iowa House. It has a bathhouse attached. We can get you cleaned up there, maybe find you a fresh dress, and then we will go see your cousin." "I told you, I have no money," Grace said, and Blake could hear the frustration in her voice, the helplessness of being dependent on charity. "And I told you I did not ask for payment." Blake kept his voice firm. "Miss Zimmerman, Grace, I am not keeping score here. I am just trying to help a person in need. If our situations were reversed, I would hope you would do the same for me." She did not answer right away, but Blake felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "I will pay you back," she finally said. "Once I am working, once I have money again, I will pay back every cent. If it makes you feel better to think that way, fine." Blake guided Chester onto Main Street, nodding to a few folks he recognized. The town was busy with the afternoon traffic, wagons and horses and people on foot, all going about their business. "But I am not going to hold you to it." The Iowa house was a three-story building with a fresh coat of white paint and a wide porch where several men sat smoking and watching the street. Blake helped Grace down from the horse, noting how she swayed slightly when her feet hit the ground. He caught her elbow to steady her, and she shot him a grateful look. Inside, the hotel lobby was cool and dim, a relief from the blazing sun. The clerk behind the desk, a thin man with spectacles and a receding hairline, looked up from his ledger and took in Grace's disheveled appearance with poorly concealed distaste. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he would much rather not. "We need a room for the lady to clean up in and access to the bathhouse," Blake said, pulling out his wallet. "How much?" The clerk's eyes flickered to Grace, then back to Blake. "For a room and bath, that will be $2. It was highway robbery, more than twice what it should cost, but Blake was not in the mood to argue. He counted out the money and slapped it on the counter. "And we will need a dress for the lady, something simple but respectable. Can you have your wife or one of the maids find something?" The clerk pocketed the money, suddenly more agreeable. "I am sure we can arrange that. Room 7, top of the stairs to the left. I will have hot water brought up and see about the dress." Blake took the key and led Grace up the stairs. The room was small but clean, with a bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. Grace stood in the middle of the room, still holding that empty bag, looking lost. "The bath will be here soon," Blake said gently. "Take your time getting cleaned up. I will wait downstairs, and when you are ready, we will go find your cousin." Grace turned to look at him, and the expression on her face was complex, gratitude mixed with something else Blake could not quite name. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You do not know me." "For all you know, I could be lying about everything." Blake considered the question, considered all the easy answers he could give. But standing there in that small hotel room, looking at this woman who had lost everything but somehow still had hope, he found himself telling her the truth. "5 years ago, I was down on my luck in Abilene. Lost all my money in a card game, had not eaten in 2 days, and was seriously considering some options that would have put me on the wrong side of the law." He met her eyes. "A stranger bought me dinner and gave me enough money to get back on my feet. Said the only payment he wanted was for me to do the same for someone else when I got the chance. I guess I have been waiting for the right person to come along." "You saying you still had hope, even holding that empty bag that told me you were the right person." Grace's eyes glistened, but still she did not cry. "I will pay it forward too then," she said quietly. "When I can, I will help someone else. That is all I ask." Blake tipped his hat to her and headed for the door. "Take your time. I will be downstairs." He spent the next hour sitting on the porch of the Iowa house, smoking a cigarette and watching the town go by. Council Bluffs was a good town, the kind of place a man could put down roots if he had a mind to. Blake had been drifting for years now, ever since his own father had died and left him the small cattle operation. He had grown it into something successful, but it had never felt like home, not the way some places did for some people. He was thinking about this, about home and belonging, and why a woman clutching an empty bag had affected him so deeply, when Grace appeared at the top of the stairs. Blake stood up so fast he nearly knocked over his chair. She was transformed. The bath and clean dress had revealed what the dust and desperation had hidden. Her dark hair, now clean and pinned up properly, shone in the afternoon light. The dress the hotel had provided was a simple gray cotton with a white collar, nothing fancy, but it fit her well and made her look respectable, like a schoolteacher or a minister's daughter. But it was her face that struck Blake most. With the dirt washed away, he could see the fine bone structure, the intelligence in those gray eyes, the strength in the set of her mouth. She was beautiful. not in the flashy way of saloon girls or the pampered way of wealthy merchants' daughters, but in a real, solid way that made Blake's heart kick hard against his ribs. "Will I do?" Grace asked, and there was uncertainty in her voice, as if she did not know her own worth. "You look fine," Blake managed, though the word was inadequate. She looked considerably more than fine, but he did not think saying so would be appropriate, given they had only known each other for a few hours. Grace still carried the empty bag, he noticed, though now it was folded neatly and tucked under her arm. She caught him looking at it and smiled slightly. "I know it seems foolish, keeping an empty bag, but it reminds me that I can survive losing everything. It reminds me that hope is sometimes all we need." "It is not foolish," Blake said, and he meant it. He offered her his arm, and after a brief hesitation, she took it. "Ready to find your cousin." They walked through the streets of Council Bluffs together, and Blake found himself acutely aware of every place where Grace's hand rested on his arm, every time she leaned slightly closer when a wagon passed by, or when the boardwalk got crowded. He had not expected this sudden and intense awareness of another person. It felt dangerous somehow, like standing too close to a cliff edge, but Blake did not pull away. 3rd Street was in the residential section of town, where the buildings were smaller and more personal, homes and small businesses mixed together. The Zimmerman house was easy to spot, a large 2-story building with a sign hanging out front and lace curtains in the windows. The front garden was well tended, with flowers blooming despite the summer heat, and the whole place had an air of respectability and care. Grace stopped at the front gate, and Blake felt her hand tighten on his arm. "What if she does not want me anymore?" she asked quietly. "What if she thinks I am too much trouble?" "Then she is not worth knowing," Blake said firmly, "but I doubt that is going to happen. Family is family." Grace took a deep breath and pushed open the gate. They walked up the path together, and Blake knocked on the front door. For a long moment, nothing happened, and then the door swung open to reveal a woman in her late 30s, plump and pretty, with the same gray eyes as Grace. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, and then her gaze locked on Grace. Her mouth fell open. "Grace! Oh my Lord, Grace!" "Hello, Martha," Grace said, and her voice finally broke. "I am sorry I am late." Martha pulled Grace into a fierce hug, talking a mile a minute about worry and prayers and thank heavens, and Blake found himself stepping back, giving them space for their reunion. He should leave now, he knew. His job was done. He had gotten Grace to her cousin safely, and now she would be fine. She did not need him anymore, but he found he did not want to leave. Not yet. Martha finally pulled back from Grace and seemed to notice Blake for the first time. "And who is this?" she asked, her tone suddenly cautious. "This is Blake Rawlins," Grace said quickly. "He found me on the road after I was robbed. He brought me here, bought me a bath and a dress, would not take no for an answer." She turned to look at Blake, and the gratitude in her eyes made his chest tight. "He saved my life, Martha. I would have died out there if not for him." Martha's expression transformed into something warm and grateful. "Mr. Rawlins, I cannot thank you enough. Please come inside. Let me at least offer you dinner and a place to stay the night. It is the least I can do." Blake started to refuse, but then Grace said, "Please, I would like you to stay." So he found himself following the 2 women inside the boarding house, into a parlor that was comfortable and homey, with good furniture and the smell of fresh bread coming from somewhere in the back. Martha hustled off to get tea and something more substantial, leaving Blake and Grace alone for a moment. "You do not have to stay," Grace said softly. "I know you have done more than enough already." "I want to," Blake admitted. "Unless you would rather I left." "No." Grace sat down on the sofa, and Blake noticed she was still holding the empty bag, had not let go of it through the whole reunion. "No, I would like you to stay. I would like to hear more about you, about your life. I feel like I told you everything about me on the ride here, but I know almost nothing about you." So Blake found himself staying for dinner, which turned into staying the evening, which turned into accepting Martha's offer of a room for the night since it was getting late, and Blake had admitted he did not have anywhere else specific to be. Over roast chicken and potatoes, Blake told them about his life, about growing up on a small ranch in Kansas, about learning the cattle business from his father, about the years of driving herds and building up his operation. "So you are a successful businessman," Martha said, clearly reassessing him. "And yet you were just riding through Council Bluffs alone." "I had some business to attend to here," Blake said, which was only partially true. Really, he had been drifting, trying to figure out what came next in his life. "But I am thinking about settling down somewhere permanent. The cattle business is getting more stable now, with the railroads. Does not require as much moving around as it used to." "Council Bluffs is a good town for settling," Martha said. "Growing fast, lots of opportunity, and the people are decent for the most part." Blake glanced at Grace, who was picking at her food with more appetite than actual eating. She looked exhausted, and he did not blame her. It had been a hell of a day for her. "You should get some rest," he said gently. "You have been through a lot." Grace met his eyes and nodded. "You are right. I am suddenly very tired." She stood up, and Blake stood with her automatically. "Thank you again, Blake, for everything." "You are welcome." He wanted to say more, wanted to say that she should not thank him, that finding her had felt like finding something he had been looking for without knowing it, but that would sound crazy. They had only known each other for less than a day. These feelings did not make sense. But sense or not, they were there. Grace went upstairs with Martha, and Blake found himself alone in the parlor with a cup of coffee and his thoughts. He should leave in the morning, he told himself. Grace was safe now, with family, and she did not need him complicating her life. She needed to focus on building her new start here, not dealing with whatever this was between them. But when morning came, Blake found reasons to stay. He helped Martha fix a loose board on the porch. He went to the general store to pick up supplies for her. He found himself staying for breakfast, then lunch, then agreeing when Martha suggested he might as well keep the room another night since he had paid for it anyway. Grace was quiet that second day, but Blake caught her watching him several times, a thoughtful expression on her face. That evening, after dinner, she asked if he would take a walk with her, and Blake agreed before Martha could suggest it was improper. They walked through the streets of Council Bluffs as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Grace had left the empty bag at the boarding house, Blake noticed, and he wondered what that meant. "Martha offered me a partnership in the boarding house," Grace said as they walked. "Not right away, but eventually, once I have learned the business and proven myself. It is more than I hoped for when I set out from Pennsylvania." "That is wonderful," Blake said, and he meant it, even as a part of him sank at the finality of it. She was building a life here which was exactly what she should do. "Your cousin seems like a good woman." "She is. I am lucky." Grace stopped walking and turned to face him. "But I have been thinking about something, and I need to ask you directly. Why are you still here, Blake?" The question caught him off guard, though maybe it should not have. Grace was clearly a woman who faced things head-on. "I am not sure," he admitted. "I told myself I was just making sure you were settled, but that is not completely true." "Then what is true?" Grace stepped closer, and in the fading light her eyes looked almost silver. "Because I have been trying to understand this. You are a stranger who saved my life, and now you cannot seem to leave, and I cannot seem to want you to leave. That does not make sense. We do not know each other." "No," Blake agreed. "We do not. but I keep thinking about you holding that empty bag, saying you lost everything except hope. I keep thinking about how brave that was, how strong, and I keep thinking that maybe I've been looking for someone like you without knowing it." Grace was quiet for a long moment. "I am not brave," she finally said. "I was terrified out there on that road. I thought I might die, and I was so angry at the unfairness of it, at losing my father and then losing everything else. That bag was not empty by choice. It was empty because bandits took everything that was supposed to be my future." "But you held on to it anyway," Blake said. "And you held on to hope. That is brave, Grace. That is strength." She looked up at him, and Blake saw the vulnerability in her face, the fear and the longing all mixed together. "What are we doing?" she whispered. "What is this?" "I do not know," Blake admitted, "but I would like to find out." "If you want to." "I want to," Grace said, and then she was stepping closer, and Blake was pulling her into his arms, and they were kissing there on the street corner as the last light faded from the sky. It was not a gentle kiss, not soft or questioning. It was desperate and real, two people who had found something unexpected and were afraid to let it go. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Grace laughed shakily. "Well, that happened." "Yes, it did." Blake kept his arms around her, not ready to let go yet. "Grace, I am not good with words, and I know this is fast, probably too fast, but I do not want to leave Council Bluffs. Not yet. Not until we have figured out what this is between us." "I would like that," Grace said softly, "but I have nothing to offer you, Blake. No money, no property, nothing but a partnership in a boarding house that is not even mine yet. You are a successful cattleman. You could have your pick of women." "I do not want my pick of women," Blake said firmly. "I want you. I want the woman who held an empty bag and said she still had hope. I want to get to know you, Grace Zimmerman. I want to court you properly if you will let me." Grace smiled then, a real smile that transformed her whole face. "I think I would like that very much." They walked back to the boarding house hand in hand, and if Martha noticed the change between them, she was kind enough not to comment directly. But Blake caught the knowing smile she gave Grace, and the approving nod she gave him when Grace was not looking. Blake rented the room at the boarding house for a week, then another week, then a month. He courted Grace the old-fashioned way, with walks and dinners, and sitting in the parlor under Martha's watchful eye. He told her everything about his life, the good and the bad, and she told him about growing up with just her father, about learning to be strong because there was no other choice, about the grief that had threatened to drown her after her father died. "I almost gave up," she confessed one evening as they sat on the porch swing, watching the stars come out. "When those bandits took everything, I almost just laid down and gave up. But then I thought about my father, about how disappointed he would be if I did not at least try to survive. So I held onto that bag and I told myself I still had hope, and I kept breathing until you came along." "I am glad you did," Blake said, pulling her closer. "I am glad you kept breathing. I am glad you kept hoping." "So am I," Grace said and kissed him. The weeks turned into months, and Blake found himself fitting into the life of Council Bluffs more easily than he had expected. He sold his cattle operation in Kansas, taking a good profit, and started looking into business opportunities in town. He invested in a new feed and grain store that was opening, went into partnership with a man who was starting a freight business. He kept his room at the boarding house, and everyone in town knew he was courting Grace Zimmerman, the woman who had come to town with nothing but an empty bag and hope. Grace bloomed under Martha's guidance, learning the ins and outs of running a boarding house. She was good with the guests, friendly but firm, and she had a knack for making people feel welcome. Martha started letting her handle more and more of the business, and Blake could see the partnership becoming real. could see Grace building something solid and lasting. 6 months after he found Grace on that dusty road, Blake knew he wanted to marry her. He had known it for months, really, but he wanted to be sure he could offer her something real, something stable. He wanted to be worthy of a woman who had held on to hope even when she had nothing else. He asked Martha's permission first, out of respect, and she gave it with tears in her eyes and a fierce hug. "You are a good man, Blake Rawlins," she said. "Grace deserves a good man after everything she has been through." Then he went to the jeweler and picked out a simple gold ring with a small diamond. Nothing flashy, but something lasting. And on a cold November evening, with the first snow starting to fall, he took Grace for a walk to the spot where they had first kissed. "Grace," he said, taking her hands in his, "I am not good with fancy words, and I am probably doing this all wrong, but I want you to know that finding you, helping you, it changed my life. You changed my life. I was drifting before, not knowing what I was looking for. But you were what I was looking for, you and your strength and your hope." Grace's eyes were shining with tears, but she was smiling. "Blake, let me finish," he said gently and pulled out the ring. "Grace Zimmerman, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Would you let me spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the woman who lost everything except hope?" "Yes," Grace said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, Blake, I will marry you." He slipped the ring on her finger and kissed her as the snow fell around them, and Blake thought about that empty bag, about how sometimes losing everything was just the beginning of finding what you really needed. They were married in March of 1876, in a small ceremony at the Methodist Church with Martha and the boarding house guests in attendance. Grace wore a white dress that Martha had helped her make, and she carried a bouquet of early spring flowers. But around her wrist, tied with a ribbon, she wore that empty bag, folded small but still present. "I want to remember," she told Blake when he asked about it. "I want to remember where I came from, what I survived, and I want to remember the man who helped me when I had nothing." "You never had nothing," Blake said, kissing her forehead. "You always had hope, and now you have me too." "Now I have you too," Grace agreed, and they sealed their vows with a kiss that promised everything ahead would be better than what came before. Blake bought them a house on 5th Street, a modest 2-story with a yard big enough for the garden Grace wanted, and the workshop Blake planned to build. Grace continued working at the boarding house, now as a full partner with Martha, and Blake's business investments continued to grow. They settled into married life with the comfort of people who had known struggle and appreciated stability. But it was not always easy. That first year of marriage had its challenges. Blake struggled with wanting to protect Grace from everything, remembering how he had found her, and Grace struggled with her independence, with not wanting to be seen as helpless. They had their first real fight about 3 months after the wedding, when Blake tried to insist that Grace should not walk home from the boarding house alone after dark. "I am not a child," Grace said, her voice sharp, "and I am not made of glass. I can walk for blocks after dark without falling apart." "I know that," Blake shot back, "but I also know there are dangers out there. I found you on that road, Grace. I saw what almost happened to you. I cannot lose you." "You found me surviving," Grace corrected, her eyes flashing. "You found me holding on and refusing to give up. That woman is still who I am, Blake. Marrying you did not make me weak." Blake stopped, really hearing her for the first time. "I never thought you were weak," he said quietly. "I think you are the strongest person I know, but you are right. I have been treating you like you need protecting instead of trusting that you can take care of yourself." Grace's expression softened. "I do not mind you wanting to walk me home," she said. "I like spending that time with you. But I need you to want it because you enjoy my company, not because you think I cannot do it alone." "I do enjoy your company," Blake said, crossing the room to pull her into his arms. "You are my favorite person to spend time with. Can we start over? Can I ask if you would like me to walk you home sometimes, just because I like being with you?" "Yes," Grace said, tilting her face up for a kiss. "We can start over." They learned each other through that first year, learned how to fight fair and make up better, learned each other's rhythms and moods. Grace learned that Blake needed quiet time after a particularly stressful day, needed to sit and think without conversation. Blake learned that Grace sometimes woke up from nightmares about the bandits, about being left alone on that road, and that the best thing he could do was hold her and remind her she was safe. In the spring of 1877, Grace told Blake she was pregnant. They had been married just over a year, and Blake felt a terror he had never experienced before, even in the most dangerous cattle drives. The thought of something happening to Grace, of losing her in childbirth the way so many women were lost, made him cold with fear. But Grace was calm, even radiant. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she reminded him when she caught him hovering for the 10th time that day. "I am strong and healthy, and we have a good doctor here. Everything will be fine." "You do not know that," Blake said, unable to keep the fear out of his voice. Grace took his hands and placed them on her still flat stomach. "No, I do not know that for certain," she admitted. "But I have hope. Remember, I always have hope." And it turned out her hope was justified. In January of 1878, Grace gave birth to a healthy baby boy they named Benjamin Thomas Rawlins. Blake held his son for the first time with hands that shook, looking down at the tiny face and feeling something shift in his chest, something profound and permanent. "He is perfect," he whispered, and Grace, exhausted but smiling, nodded. "He is ours," she said. "Our little miracle." Benjamin was a good baby, easy-going and curious, with Blake's dark hair and Grace's gray eyes. Grace took a few months off from the boarding house to care for him, but by the time spring came, she was eager to get back to work, at least part-time. They hired a young woman named Sarah to help with Benjamin and the house, and the arrangement worked well. Life settled into a comfortable pattern. Blake's businesses continued to thrive. The freight company expanded into 3 nearby towns, and the feed and grain store became one of the most successful in Council Bluffs. Grace and Martha ran the boarding house with quiet efficiency, and it became known as one of the best places to stay in the area, clean and comfortable with excellent food. In 1880, Grace had their second child, a daughter they named Caroline Martha Rawlins, after no one in particular, except that Grace loved the name Caroline and wanted to honor Martha with the middle name. Caroline was as different from Benjamin as could be, fussy and demanding, but with a smile that could melt hearts. "She is going to be trouble," Blake said fondly, watching his 2-year-old daughter charm cookies out of Martha. "She is going to be strong," Grace corrected. "Like her mother." "Like her mother," Blake agreed, and pulled Grace close, marveling as he often did at how his life had changed since that July day when he had found a woman holding an empty bag. The years passed, marked by the small joys and struggles of family life. Benjamin started school and showed an aptitude for numbers that made Blake think he might take to business someday. Caroline proved to be as stubborn as both her parents combined, but with a tender heart that showed itself in how she cared for stray animals and younger children. In 1883, Grace and Martha expanded the boarding house, adding on 6 more rooms. It was a big investment, but Council Bluffs continued to grow, and the demand was there. Blake helped with the financing and the construction, and the expansion was a success. The Zimmerman house became one of the premier lodging establishments in the area. Through it all, Grace kept that empty bag. It lived in a drawer in their bedroom, folded carefully and wrapped in tissue paper. Sometimes Blake would catch her taking it out and just holding it, remembering. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked her once, finding her like this late one evening. "Regret how we started? Wish you had come to Council Bluffs under better circumstances?" Grace looked at him, surprised. "Never," she said firmly. "Not once. If I had arrived with money and belongings, I would have been just another boarder at Martha's place. I would have gotten work, built a life, and probably been perfectly content. But I never would have met you." "You might have met me anyway," Blake pointed out. "Council Bluffs is not that big." "Maybe," Grace allowed. "But it would not have been the same. You would not have seen me, not really, and I would not have seen you. It took me being at my lowest point, holding an empty bag and claiming I still had hope, for us to really see each other." She stood up and went to Blake, wrapping her arms around him. "I lost everything that day those bandits robbed me," she said quietly. "But I found you. And you are worth more than anything that was in that wagon, more than anything I left behind in Pennsylvania. You and our children, this life we have built, it is worth every hard moment it took to get here." Blake held her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her in his arms. "I love you," he said, because sometimes the simple words were the only ones that mattered. "I love you too," Grace replied. "My rescuer, my friend, my husband, my home." In 1885, when Benjamin was 7 and Caroline was 5, Grace had another baby, a boy they named Thomas William. He was a surprise, Grace having thought they were done with babies, but a welcome one. Thomas was a blend of both his siblings, easygoing like Benjamin but with Caroline's determined streak. "Our family is complete," Grace said, holding baby Thomas while Benjamin and Caroline crowded around to see their new brother. "This is everything I hoped for and more." Blake looked at his family, at his wife and 3 children, at the home they had built together, and felt a contentment he had never expected to find. He thought about the man he had been before that July day in 1875, drifting and unsettled, not knowing what he was looking for. And he thought about the woman he had found on the side of the road, clutching an empty bag and claiming she still had hope. Sometimes the most important moments in life came when you were not looking for them. Sometimes you had to lose everything to find what really mattered. The children grew. Benjamin proved to have his father's head for business, and by the time he was 15, he was helping Blake manage the freight company. Caroline showed an artistic talent that surprised everyone, and Grace encouraged her by getting her art supplies and lessons from a traveling painter who stayed at the boarding house. Thomas was still young, but he showed signs of being the most scholarly of the 3, always with his nose in a book. In 1890, Martha passed away quietly in her sleep at the age of 53. It was a shock to everyone, and Grace grieved deeply for the cousin who had offered her a new start and become like a mother to her. But Martha had left her share of the boarding house to Grace completely, trusting that Grace would continue to run it well. "She believed in me when I had nothing," Grace said at the funeral, tears streaming down her face. "She gave me a chance when all I had was hope. I will never forget that." Blake held her as she cried, and later when they were alone, he said, "You have given chances to others too. You have paid forward what Martha did for you, what that stranger did for me all those years ago in Abilene. You have made a difference, Grace." And it was true. Over the years, Grace had quietly helped dozens of people who had come to Council Bluffs with nothing. She hired women who needed work, gave credit to families struggling to get started, offered rooms at reduced rates to those in genuine need. She never turned away someone who was really trying. "It is what you do when you remember what it is like to have nothing," Grace said simply. "You help others when you can." In 1892, Benjamin, now 14, asked his father about the story of how his parents met. They were working together in the freight office, going over accounts, and something had prompted the question. Blake leaned back in his chair and smiled. "I found your mother on the side of the road between here and Omaha," he said. "She was holding an empty bag, and when I asked what happened, she said she had lost everything except hope." An empty bag? Benjamin looked confused. What did that mean? It meant she had been robbed of everything she owned, Blake explained. Everything except her determination to survive, to keep going. That bag was empty, but she held onto it anyway, and that is when I knew she was someone special. "So you fell in love with her because she was holding an empty bag?" Benjamin was trying to understand. Blake could tell. "No," Blake said. "I fell in love with her because of what that empty bag represented. It represented hope and strength and courage. Your mother could have given up that day, but she did not. She chose to keep hoping, keep fighting, and I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to help her, and then I wanted to know her, and then I realized I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her." Benjamin was quiet for a moment, processing this. "Does she still have the bag?" he finally asked. "She does," Blake confirmed. "She keeps it to remember. To remember where she came from and what she survived and how it all brought us together." "That is a good story," Benjamin said. "A really good story." "It is our story," Blake said, "and it is true, every word of it." That evening, Blake told Grace about the conversation with Benjamin, and Grace smiled. "Maybe we should tell all the children the whole story," she said. "Maybe it is time they understood." So they gathered their family that night after dinner, all 3 children, and Blake and Grace told them the whole story of how they met. They told about the robbery, about Grace being left with nothing, about Blake finding her and bringing her to Council Bluffs. They told about the courtship and the marriage and how love sometimes comes when you least expect it but most need it. Caroline, now 12 and prone to romance, sighed dreamily. "That is the most romantic thing I have ever heard." Thomas, at 7, was more practical. "But were not you scared, Mama, being all alone like that?" "Terrified," Grace admitted. "But I was more scared of giving up, of letting those bandits win by taking away my hope along with my belongings. So I held onto that bag and I held onto hope, and your father came along." "Like a hero in a story," Caroline said. "Like a good man at the right time," Grace corrected gently. "Your father is not a hero, sweetheart. He is just a man who saw someone in need and decided to help. That is what good people do." But Blake caught her eye across the table and saw the warmth there, the love that had only grown deeper over 17 years of marriage. To Grace, he was a hero, just as she was to him. They had saved each other in different ways, and built a life neither of them could have imagined during those first desperate hours on the road to Council Bluffs. As the years continued to pass, Blake and Grace became pillars of the Council Bluffs community. Blake served on the town council for several terms, helping guide the growth and development of the area. Grace continued to run the boarding house, now with Benjamin's help as he grew older, and showed an interest in the hospitality business along with his work in freight. In 1895, Benjamin married a young woman named Ellen who had come to town as a teacher. It was a good match, and Blake and Grace welcomed their daughter-in-law warmly. When Benjamin and Ellen had their first child in 1896, a boy they named Robert, Blake held his grandson and marveled at how life continued forward, how that moment on the road 21 years ago had led to this, to a whole new generation. Caroline, true to her artistic nature, became a painter of some local renown. She never married, choosing instead to focus on her art and helping Grace run the boarding house. She was happy, she insisted when Grace worried, and Blake believed her. Some people were meant for conventional paths, and some were not, and Caroline was content with her choices. Thomas went to college in Iowa City, studying law, and eventually came back to Council Bluffs to set up a practice. He married a banker's daughter named Louise in 1900, and they gave Blake and Grace 2 more grandchildren, twin girls named Emma and Alina. Through all of this, through the joys and sorrows, the successes and struggles, Blake and Grace remained partners in the truest sense. They still took walks together in the evenings when weather permitted. They still talked about everything, from business decisions to worries about the children to memories of how they met. And sometimes, Grace would take out that empty bag and they would remember together. In 1905, Council Bluffs celebrated 30 years since Blake and Grace had met. It was not an official celebration, just something they marked privately, but Benjamin organized a family dinner with all their children and grandchildren present. After the meal, when asked to say a few words, Blake stood up and looked around the table at all the faces looking back at him. 30 years ago, I was riding into Council Bluffs alone, not knowing what I was looking for, he said. And I found your mother, your grandmother, sitting on the side of the road with nothing but an empty bag and hope. I could have ridden past, probably should have if I am being practical. But something made me stop, made me help, made me stay. And that choice, that simple choice to stop and help someone in need, led to all of this. He gestured around the table. It led to a marriage that has been the foundation of my life. It led to 3 wonderful children and 5 grandchildren so far. It led to businesses and friendships and a life richer than I ever imagined possible. All because I stopped to help a woman holding an empty bag. Grace stood up beside him, and Blake saw she was holding the bag, had brought it down from their room for this occasion. And I was sitting on that road, terrified and alone, holding this empty bag and telling myself I still had hope, she said, her voice strong and clear. I did not know what I was hoping for, just that I had to keep hoping. And then Blake came along and he gave me more than just a ride to town or a meal or a place to clean up. He gave me a chance at a new life. He gave me love and partnership and a family. He gave me everything. She held up the empty bag. I keep this to remember. To remember that sometimes losing everything is the beginning of finding what really matters. To remember that hope is never wasted. To remember that good people exist, people who will stop and help even when they do not have to. Caroline was crying, Blake noticed, and Ellen was dabbing at her eyes. Even Benjamin looked moved, though he tried to hide it. The grandchildren were too young to fully understand, but they would someday. They would hear this story and understand what their grandparents had built from nothing but hope and human kindness. Blake pulled Grace close and kissed her forehead. "Best decision I ever made," he murmured, just for her. "Mine too," Grace whispered back, holding on to hope. "Best decision I ever made." The years continued their march forward. Blake and Grace grew older together, their hair going gray, their steps slowing slightly, but their love remaining constant. They celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary in 1906, surrounded again by family and friends. The boarding house continued to thrive under Grace's management, now with Caroline as her primary partner since Benjamin had moved into freight full-time. In 1908, Blake had a scare with his heart that frightened everyone. The doctor ordered rest and less stress, and Blake reluctantly stepped back from some of his business responsibilities, letting Benjamin and Thomas take on more. But he recovered, and Grace nursed him through it with the same determination she had shown clutching that empty bag all those years ago. "You are not leaving me," she informed him when he was at his weakest, most scared. "We have a deal, remember, forever. I held on to hope when I had nothing else, and I am holding on to you now." Blake, tired and aching, smiled at her. "Yes, madam, I would not dream of going back on our deal." He lived, stronger than the doctors expected, and they celebrated Christmas that year with particular gratitude. By 1910, Blake was mostly recovered and back to light work, though Grace watched him like a hawk to make sure he did not overdo it. They had been married 34 years by then, together for 35, and they moved with the ease of two people who knew each other completely. Blake knew that Grace liked her coffee with cream and sugar, that she sometimes still had nightmares about being robbed, that she worried constantly about their children but tried not to show it. Grace knew that Blake needed his quiet time in the mornings, that he had never quite forgiven himself for not finding her before the bandits did, even though that made no logical sense, that he loved her with a constancy that had never wavered in all their years together. In the spring of 1912, Grace found a lump in her breast. The doctor was grave, said it needed to come out, that even then the prognosis was uncertain. Blake wanted to rage at the unfairness of it, wanted to demand why this was happening after everything Grace had already survived. But he knew that would not help, so instead he held her hand through the surgery and the recovery, and he prayed harder than he had ever prayed in his life. Grace survived the surgery, though it took a lot out of her. She was 60 years old by then, and recovery was slow. But she approached it the same way she had approached everything else in her life, with determination and hope. "I am not done yet," she told Blake when he got too hovering, too worried. "I have grandchildren to watch grow up. I have a business to run. I have a husband to love. I am not going anywhere." And she did not. She recovered slowly but surely, and by the fall of 1912, she was back to running the boarding house part-time, with Caroline handling most of the physical work but Grace still managing the business side. Blake reduced his work even more to spend time with her, and they fell into a new rhythm, one that acknowledged they were getting older but refused to give up on life. In 1915, they celebrated 40 years since they met. Benjamin organized another family dinner, now with even more grandchildren in attendance, and Blake and Grace sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the legacy of that day on the road. 40 years, Blake said, looking at Grace. 40 years since I found you holding an empty bag. 40 years since you stopped when you did not have to, Grace replied. 40 years of love and partnership and family, best 40 years of my life. Mine too, Blake agreed, and they kissed to the applause and good-natured teasing of their family. The empty bag still lived in their bedroom drawer, still wrapped carefully in tissue paper. Sometimes their grandchildren would ask about it, and Grace would take it out and tell them the story, about being robbed and left with nothing, about holding on to hope, about their grandfather stopping to help a stranger. That bag was empty, she would tell them, but it was also full. Full of hope, full of possibility, full of the future I did not know was coming. Sometimes empty is just the space waiting to be filled with something better than what was lost. The children would nod, not fully understanding but sensing the importance of it, and Grace would fold the bag carefully and put it away again, a talisman of the life she and Blake had built. In 1918, the Spanish flu swept through Iowa, and Council Bluffs was not spared. Blake and Grace, older and more vulnerable, were careful, but Thomas fell ill. For terrible days they waited and prayed, and Grace held that empty bag and remembered surviving impossible things before. Thomas recovered, though it was a near thing, and the family breathed easier. "Life is fragile," Blake said to Grace one evening after they had gotten the good news about Thomas. "More fragile than we want to admit. Every day we have is a gift." "Yes," Grace agreed. "Every day since you found me has been a gift. Even the hard days, the scary days, all of it a gift." They held each other, Two people who had learned the value of hope and love and human connection, and they were grateful for every moment they had together. In 1920, women got the right to vote, and Grace cast her ballot with tears in her eyes, thinking about how far the world had come since she was left on the side of a road with nothing. Blake went with her, proud of his wife who had always been strong, always been capable, and was now recognized as a full citizen with a voice that counted. The 1920s brought prosperity and change. Council Bluffs continued to grow and modernize. Cars became common, replacing horses for everyday travel. The boarding house adapted, now catering to automobile travelers as well as train passengers. Blake and Grace adapted too, though they watched the changes with the eyes of people who remembered a different era. In 1925, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, a remarkable achievement. The whole town seemed to turn out for the celebration, which Benjamin and Caroline organized. There were speeches and toasts, and Blake and Grace danced slowly to music played by a small orchestra, moving carefully but still moving still together. 50 years, Grace said, her head on Blake's shoulder as they danced. Who would have thought that day on the road that we would have this? I would not have dared to hope for it, Blake admitted, but I am grateful for every day. So am I, Grace said, my rescuer, my love, my home. They were 73 and 67 respectively by then, old by most standards, but they were still sharp, still engaged with life. Blake still consulted on business decisions, though he left the day-to-day operations to Benjamin and Thomas. Grace still oversaw the boarding house with Caroline, though she no longer did any of the physical work, and they still had each other. In 1927, Blake's health started to decline more seriously. His heart, which had troubled him before, grew weaker. The doctors said there was not much to be done, that it was simply the march of time. Blake accepted it with more grace than Grace did. She railed against it, refused to accept that their time was running out. We have more years left, she insisted, even as Blake grew frailer. We have more time. Maybe, Blake said gently, taking her hand. But if we do not, Grace, I want you to know that I have no regrets. Finding you, helping you, marrying you, building this life with you, it has been the greatest privilege of my existence. You made me a better man. You gave me a family and a purpose, and a love I never thought I would find. Stop talking like that, Grace said fiercely, tears streaming down her face. Stop talking like you are saying goodbye. I am not saying goodbye, Blake promised. I am just saying thank you for holding on to hope that day, for letting me help you, for building this life with me. Thank you, Grace. Blake passed away peacefully in his sleep on a cold February night in 1928. He was 75 years old, and he died at home, in the house they had bought together 52 years earlier, with Grace holding his hand. The town mourned the loss of one of its most respected citizens. The funeral was large, with people coming from all over the region to pay their respects. Benjamin and Caroline and Thomas stood with their mother, supporting her through the loss, and the grandchildren, now grown with children of their own, grieved for the grandfather who had taught them about honor and kindness. But Grace was devastated. For the first time since that day on the road, she felt truly alone, truly bereft. The man who had stopped to help a stranger holding an empty bag, the man who had become her husband and partner and best friend, was gone. For days after the funeral, Grace could not bring herself to go through Blake's things, could not bear to make the changes that needed to be made. And then one morning, she woke up and went to the bedroom drawer. She took out the empty bag, unwrapped it from its tissue paper, and held it the way she had held it 53 years ago on that dusty road. I lost everything except hope, she whispered, the words she had said to Blake when he first found her. And she realized they were true again, in a different way. She had lost Blake, her partner of 52 years, and the pain of that loss was almost unbearable. But she still had hope. Hope that she would see him again someday, in whatever came after this life. Hope that the love they had built would last beyond death. Hope that she could continue living for their children and grandchildren, for the legacy they had built together. She kept the empty bag on her bedside table after that, a reminder of surviving impossible loss and holding on to hope anyway. And slowly, day by day, Grace began to live again. She spent time with her children and grandchildren, sharing stories of Blake, keeping his memory alive. She continued to work at the boarding house with Caroline, finding purpose in the daily routines, and she held on to hope. Grace lived for another 7 years after Blake's death. She was active and sharp until the end, still running her share of the boarding house, still offering advice and guidance to her family. And on a spring morning in 1935, she passed away peacefully at the age of 80, with her children by her side. They buried her next to Blake in the Council Bluffs Cemetery, under a large oak tree. And at her own request, they placed the empty bag in her casket, the symbol of hope and survival and the love story that had begun with a cowboy stopping to help a woman who had lost everything except hope. Benjamin, now 57 and the patriarch of a large family, stood at his mother's grave and told the assembled family the story one more time, the story of how his parents met, how a simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love that lasted more than 50 years and created a legacy that would continue for generations. "My father could have ridden past that day," Benjamin said, his voice carrying across the cemetery. "And my mother could have given up, could have let herself die on that road. But he stopped, and she held on to hope, and from that moment of connection came all of us. Every person here exists because Blake Rawlins saw someone in need and decided to help, and because Grace Zimmerman refused to give up even when she had nothing." He held up a photograph, one of the last taken of Blake and Grace together. Two old people holding hands and smiling at each other with a love that was visible even in the frozen image. "This is what hope looks like," he said. "This is what choosing to help, choosing to love, choosing to believe in better things can create. My parents taught me that, and I hope I have taught it to my children, and they will teach it to theirs." The family gathered that evening at the big house on 5th Street. The house Blake and Grace had bought so long ago, and that now belonged to Benjamin and his family. They told stories and looked through old photographs, and someone brought out the empty bag, preserved all these years, and they passed it around, each person holding it for a moment and thinking about what it represented. Caroline, now 62 and still unmarried, still dedicated to her art, held the bag and cried. "Mama held on to this when she had nothing else," she said, "and she turned nothing into everything. She taught me that you do not need conventional things to have a full life. You just need hope and courage and love." Thomas, 57 and a respected lawyer, held the bag and remembered his mother's strength. "She never gave up," he said. "No matter how hard things got, she never gave up. That is the lesson we should all carry forward." The grandchildren and great-grandchildren, some of whom had never met Blake and only known Grace in her later years, listened to the stories with wonder. The tale of the cowboy and the woman with the empty bag became family legend, passed down through generations, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments in life are just the beginning of the best ones, if you hold on to hope and remain open to kindness. Years turned into decades, and the story continued to be told. Benjamin passed it to his children, who passed it to theirs. Caroline lived to be 93, painting until the very end, and she always told anyone who would listen about her parents' love story. Thomas lived to 84, and he made sure his children understood the importance of helping others, of being the person who stops when someone is in need. The boarding house, the Zimmerman house, continued to operate until 1962, when it was finally sold after Caroline's death. But the new owners kept the name, in honor of the woman who had run it with such dedication for so many years. And some say that on quiet evenings, you can still feel the presence of Grace Zimmerman walking the halls, welcoming travelers, offering hope to those who need it. The empty bag itself became a family heirloom, carefully preserved and brought out at significant family gatherings. Each generation learned the story, learned about the woman who lost everything except hope, and the man who stopped to help her. And each generation was reminded that the small choices we make, the decision to stop when we could keep riding, the decision to hope when we have every reason to despair, those are the choices that shape not just our own lives, but the lives of generations to come. In 1975, 100 years after Blake found Grace on that dusty road, the family organized a reunion in Council Bluffs. Descendants came from all over the country, more than 200 people who could trace their lineage back to that moment, when a cowboy stopped to help a stranger. They gathered at the cemetery, at the graves of Blake and Grace, and they placed flowers and told the story again. The oldest person present was Robert Rawlins, Benjamin's son, now 79 years old. He had been born just 21 years after his grandparents met, and his grandmother had told him the story countless times. Now he stood before his own children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and told it again. "My grandfather Blake found my grandmother Grace holding an empty bag," he said, his voice still strong despite his age. She had lost everything to bandits, but she told him she still had hope, and he did not just give her a ride to town or a meal. He gave her his heart, his life, his everything. And she gave him the same. And from that exchange, from that moment of connection between two people who could so easily have passed each other by, came all of us. He gestured to the crowd assembled around him, 200 faces ranging from infants to elderly, all connected by blood and by story to that moment a century ago. "We are all here because of hope," Robert said. "Because someone chose to hold on to it when they had nothing else, and because someone else chose to honor that hope by offering help. That is the legacy we carry forward. That is what it means to be part of this family." The reunion continued for 3 days, with stories and laughter and tears, with new connections made and old ones reinforced. And through it all, the empty bag was displayed in a place of honor, the symbol of where they had all come from, the reminder that loss and hope and love were the foundations of everything they had become. The story of Blake Rawlins and Grace Zimmerman became more than just family history. It became a lesson about humanity, about the importance of helping others, about holding on to hope even in the darkest moments. Their descendants went into the world with that story in their hearts, and they tried to live up to the example set by their ancestors. Some became teachers, some doctors, some business owners, some artists. But all of them carried the understanding that kindness matters, that hope is never wasted, that love can transform everything. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Blake and Grace were together again, holding hands the way they had for 52 years of marriage, looking down at the family they had created and the legacy they had left. The cowboy who could have ridden past, and the woman who refused to give up hope, together forever. Their love story echoing through generations as a testament to the power of human connection and the enduring strength of hope. The empty bag, preserved through more than a century, remained in the family, passed from generation to generation, always accompanied by the story of the day Grace Zimmerman lost everything except hope, and Blake Rawlins stopped to help a stranger who would become his wife, his partner, his love, and the mother of his children. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important things in life come from the simplest choices, from the decision to stop when you could keep going, to help when you could look away, to hope when you have every reason to despair. And in Council Bluffs, Iowa, where it all began, people still told the story of the cowboy and the woman with the empty bag, a love story born from loss and hope on a dusty road in the summer of 1875. A reminder that the best things in life often come from the most unexpected places, and that holding on to hope, even when you have lost everything else, can lead to a love that lasts beyond lifetimes.